Some information today on our speaker. Wally Davis is the founder, president, and CEO of People Trail, and his experience incorporates a broad range of consulting and 20-plus years of diverse hands-on investigative and entrepreneurial experience. He's been published and lectured extensively on industry standards, operating procedures, and investigative best practices, and under his leadership, Wally's taken People Trail to be one of the largest and fastest growing consumer reporting agencies in the U.S. So we are very happy to have him with us today, and we thank him for taking time out of his busy day to spend with us here on this webinar. And I'd like to welcome Wally. Wally, please feel free to take it away.
All right, thanks, Scott. Appreciate that introduction. Welcome, everyone. Happy to have you here. Scott mentioned in the opening that this is HRCI accredited. We also have a SHRM accreditation for this, and at the end of the slide, we'll have those numbers up. You can also get that information from Scott by either emailing, or we can get it to you so you can have the codes to put in and get the credit for this session. So just wanted to kind of go over that before we moved on. A couple of house cleaning items. If you could all please silence your cell phones, no flash photography, and I am not an attorney. I'm just kidding about that, not the attorney part, but I am not an attorney. So the information that I'm providing here is valid, and it is in line with legislation and legal requirements, but I would just check with an employment attorney in your state before approving or applying any of the suggestions that I make or anything that I say here. So I just want to get that disclaimer out there and make sure you guys understand that. So moving forward, I think Scott talked about some of the learning objectives, but I just wanted to put them up here so that we can get a recap or kind of understand where we're going to be going today. Importance of pre-employment screening, most of you probably already know that, but I have some information that might be interesting to show you, to sort of give you some validation on if you are actually already screening. Learn some of the trends. Trends are changing all the time, and they influence pre-employment screening, so we'll go over some of the best practices and how to apply those when you use your background checks and hiring decisions. And then each one of those sections will probably take about 15 minutes, and then we should have some time for some questions at the end. You can submit those questions online in the questions box, and I'd be happy to answer any questions for you. If we have some time, I may take some questions and get some answers. Otherwise, we can take care of that after the program. So why do we do background screening? I mean, why is it important? Since 9/11, there's been a huge increase in background screening. Companies are finding that it's important to do background screening. There are some real numbers that show why it's important to do it. And so the number one thing I would say is that it boosts the productivity. So it gives employers the ability to have a more productive workplace. It also falls in place with lowering the turnover rates. When you do a background screen, you're going to have better employees that are there. And moving on to reducing theft as well. There's another slide that I'll share a little later on that talks about that, some of the theft in the workplace. Along with the turnover rates, you're reducing your training costs. So there really are some dollar amounts that are associated with background checks and making sure that you have good employees to work for you, reduce the overall costs of training. And another big one, there's a lot of plaintiffs out there. There's a lot of attorneys that are fishing for applicants that have been wronged by their employee, and they're out there fishing for those employees or those candidates or consumers so they can come together and do either class action lawsuit or a lawsuit against the agency that has the money. So they're looking at the companies. They're usually the ones that will have money, so that that reduces the negligent hiring liability that you have when you do background screening. And another big one is reducing the workplace violence. And I have another slide again that I'll talk about some of those things as far as the violence in the workplace. And again, as I talk through these things, just keep in mind it's, you know, a lot of these are worst case scenarios, and a lot of these may sound like scare tactics or whatever, but they really are real live cases that happen. So the opportunity and ability for these things to happen is real. So there's a number of reasons to do pre-employment background checks, and you know, some of those reasons that I just gave are good reasons. But if we look at some of the numbers, there's been studies done. 45% of all resumes contain a fabrication or an outright lie, and so that's concerning. And if we've look at the surveys that have been done, 33% of employees admit to stealing in the last 3 years, and 18% of all violent crime take place while at work. This is kind of an interesting slide too. According to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, employers lose more than 70% of their negligent hiring cases. So there's only a 30% chance that you'll win a case when you get sued. And one of the top awards in history is $40 million. So those are very large numbers, could shut a company down, really make a big impact on your bottom line. 30% of small business failure is caused by employee theft, and you know, just the cost to replace an employee is 1 to 5 times the annual salary of that employee. So it makes sense to do some background screening. An estimated 8% of all rapes and 7% of robberies, 16% of assaults occurred while victims were actually at work. And some of these slides aren't coming in, but it has a graph on there that talks about the different, oh, here they are. They're coming in on the clicks. So nearly 1 million people are victimized by violent crime, and all of those take place at work, and that results in about 160,000 injuries each year. And if you look down the side, I've just got a couple of the main crimes: violent crimes, rape, robbery, aggravated assault, simple assault, and then it lists as victimizations and then also the injuries. So those are real costs that are borne by employers. And like I said, it's a very litigious culture. There's a lot of attorneys out there that are fishing or looking for people to find violations of laws so that they can go out and sue the companies and you know, increase their purse. So it's a big opportunity for these plaintiffs to go out and file lawsuits against companies. Another interesting fact here in the news is that the Wall Street Journal reports that 34% of all application forms contain outright lies about their experience. You know, they talk about on their, everybody wants to embellish or make themselves look better, and there's a point where, you know, people are putting degrees and that they're a doctor when they're not, and things like that. You've all heard the stories of those things happening, and it's really is the case. NBC News reported that national criminal databases have a 41% error rate. Now, what does that have to do with anything? Well, a lot of times companies are out there selling database searches and saying that it's a really good background check. Well, we wonder, with that 41% error rate, is it really a good check just to do a database search? Are there other ways that we can do and get a better search done? Business Week reported that 16% of executive resumes contain false academic claims. So the higher level are also sort of fudging on their resumes and making it look like they're better than they are. I have some kind of funny stories about applications. We had one situation where a employee came into an interview, and on his resume that he handed over to the person claimed that he was the CEO or CFO of this company, and that company happened to be the sister company of this organization he was applying for. And so, you know, he was obviously caught red-handed right there. But they're just interesting things people try to do to embellish their experience when it's not right. So, that being said, it's important to do background screens. Many of you may already have known that and understand why it's important and are doing background screening. But I just wanted to give some of the numbers and some interesting facts about what's actually happening out there so you guys can understand and maybe even be comforted in the fact that you're doing background screening, that you're saving your organization money, you're keeping your organization out of hot water with liability and things like that. So I do want to also go over now the trends that are kind of shaping some of the best practices in our industry. I've talked about some of this stuff with the litigation and the lawsuits. There's legislation out there. I'm on a government relations committee that goes back to Washington, D.C. You would not believe the amount of legislation that's put before Congress and the House, and even state legislation in each one of the states that affects background screening in some way. Many of those bills talk about fingerprinting being the gold standard. A lot of people aren't educated on that. They feel like fingerprinting, because it comes from the FBI, it must be the greatest and the best way to do a background screen. However, the FBI, by their own admission, has said that the information that they have has 50% of the information doesn't even have disposition information, so it's really not good information. So anyway, I got off on a tangent there, but legislation is coming out all the time. We have the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission that is enforcing things, such as discrimination. I have some examples of that we'll go over and talk about. And then just the risk management, overall risk management of your organizations. You know, are you guys, do you have things in place to make sure that you're comfortable with the way that you're handling the risk in your organization? The other thing that's important, the first one up there is the Fair Credit Reporting Act that does deal directly with the background screening. So we'll just kind of dive right into this. One of the things you've probably heard about is the ban the box. It's something that it's been going on for a couple of years, so it's getting a lot of attention, and maybe it's people are over talking about it. But I just wanted to bring it up because there is a lot of residual bills that are being passed and that are still going forward, and it's gaining a lot of momentum. So this is the box on an application where you have the statement, have you ever been convicted of a criminal offense? The legislation is aimed at taking that box off the application, and most employers now all over have taken that box off and are not using applications that have that on there. If you do have an application that has that box on there, you might want to consider removing that. There still are areas that you can get away with asking that, but the momentum is growing. And it's coming to a point where not only state laws, but it's getting down into municipalities and cities and smaller areas where the laws are specific to those jurisdictions. So it's becoming increasingly more difficult for employers to understand and know every single jurisdiction where there's a law that this affects. So it's something that's important to keep in mind. Also, employment laws, they're becoming more fragmented. Like I said, cities and states are starting to pass their own laws. fact, in 2015, there were some new laws that covered a wide variety of areas within the employment screening process. And a lot of those did include the ban the box laws for job applicants, criminal records, privacy on social media, credit checks. You've probably heard a lot about that. The trend towards localization, taking these laws and doing it in, cities, county level, it really has a big effect on businesses, and it discourages employers from setting up operations or hiring in places that are undue burden on them for doing business. So that's one of the concerns as well. You'll notice that some of these ban-the-box things, they're called different names. I know in San Francisco they just passed a law. It's called the Fair Chance Ordinance, the FCO, and it not only included a typical ban-the-box rule, but it also created some unique rules for criminal matters, and what they can report or what they can use to make a decision on a hire or not. So it means that in California, 57 counties operate less than one set of rules, while San Francisco has an entirely different set of rules. So if you're operating in California, it's very confusing to navigate the landscape, and unless you understand and know what's going on, there's some issues with that. I guess the best way that I could say that would be, and as an analogy, it would be like a train running through California, or even state to state for that matter, and in each state or each jurisdiction the tracks had different size tracks. So when the train got to a certain point, it just came to a screeching halt, and it's just very difficult to navigate that. So it's sort of an important thing to look at when you're looking at what when you're hiring across state lines or even in different municipalities. Something also I wanted to kind of bring out was the trends that are shaping in no harm FCRA lawsuits. Now, what does that mean? There's a lot of things that the FCRA restricts, or there's some, not a lot, I guess, for the employer. I would say there are basically three things that you have to do to apply with the FCRA. But what's happening is employers or even CRAs like my companies, if we are in violation of one of those laws and we get sued, then we're being held liable for even if there is no harm to the applicant, even if there is no harm to the candidate or the consumer. So we're finding situations where in one case someone reported some wrong information about an individual. I believe it was his father, because they had the same name. So they actually said that he made more money. So it actually helped him. It made him look better. But because the information was wrong and wasn't his information, there was a liability, there was a payout, and there was a lot of money that was lost. So we're finding that even in no harm FCRA lawsuits, there's problems that we have to deal with. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Another thing, when you're working with companies, you want to make sure, if you're using a consumer reporting agency, a CRA, that they have quality controls in place to support all of the compliance issues, and there's a lot of them. There's when you get involved with technology, there's PII, personal identifying information. Are they passing that information through secured systems? Do they have a firewall? Do they have a SOC 1 and SOC 2 compliant platform that allows them to do that? And can they prove it? Do they, have, and these things are just suggestions, but Better Business Bureau, are they abiding by laws? Do they have a certain operating procedures in place, and can they prove it? ISO is one way to look at it. There are other organizations out there. Are they accredited through a legitimate source, NAPBS? Do they have those accreditations? And those things mean that they are being audited and that they can prove that they're doing what they say they're doing. And in this industry, it's very easy to get into this industry and people think there's a lot of money to be made in doing background screening, so they'll hang up a sign and open up shop and go out and start to solicit business. So it's important to work with companies that have these things in place so that you can understand and know that you're getting a compliant product. The other interesting thing that is trending is the candidate experience. A lot of companies now, and you may be included in this, are using applicant tracking systems. Those are being made available to smaller companies. It used to be 10, 15 years ago, those applicant tracking and human capital management was only used by the larger organizations to kind of manage the whole process of the hiring and the applicants from all the way from when they submit a resume all the way through till the time that they leave the organization. And even after they leave the organization, there's things that they have to track that employee for, you know, people calling previous employers, all that stuff. There's human capital management systems that handle that employee all the way through the whole process. So the ATS, applicant tracking portion of that, is becoming more popular with the mid-market companies. So their candidate experience is very important. If we're hiring people, we want them to have a good experience. Otherwise, they're going to say, I'm out of here, go over to another company and be hired by your competition. So employers are really concerned about how their applicant experience is. And the background screening is a small part of that, but it also is a significant part because, you know, background screening turnaround times, if it takes a long time for someone to get a background check, or, you know, the drug testing process, or many companies have physicals, DOT physicals that they have to get before they can hire this person. And if those processes aren't smooth and convenient for the applicant, or at least as convenient as they can be, then, you know, they're looking at those types of things, and they want that process to be a smooth process for their applicants. I want to kind of shift gears and go into a little bit of some of the laws that are actually impacting background screening. But first, we have some consumer protection laws and privacy laws. So this has to do with things that affect the consumers and their privacy. And the number one on there, at least relating to background screening, is the Fair Credit Reporting Act, the FCRA. Another one that comes into play is the Gramm-Leach-Bailey Act, sometimes referred to as GLAB. That also comes into play. The FERPA, many of you in HR are very familiar with these laws, but those come into play with background screening. And then also on the tenant screening side, which I'm not sure if we have any tenant screening people on here who do property management, but there are Fair Housing Act actually regulates some of this stuff too. Then we go down into state regulations. We have state-specific consumer reporting rules. And these, by the way, supersede the EEO restrictions. So anything with the federal EEO, you need to look at also every state regulation. And there's also state-specific. Now let me just say a disclaimer. Not all states have these state-specific consumer rules, but they're dotting the U.S. So you do need to be aware of them. And that's the same case with all these things I'm talking about on the state regulations. So that's why it makes it more difficult, because in one state you may be okay because you're following the federal rule and you're okay, but a state regulation will actually supersede those federal rules. So there's state-specific criminal rules. There's state-specific driving record rules, what you can do with an MVR. There's state-specific education employment history rules. So all of these things are important to keep in mind when you're doing background screening. Then there are also laws that affect other things, employment laws. And many of you are familiar with the Americans with Disability Act, the ADA. There's a lot of things that deal with the ADA, with drug testing, for instance. You know, there's discrimination things. You can't ask an employee for their medications that they're on and things like that. So those things are important to be aware of. There's also the Equal Opportunity Act, sometimes referred to as the Civil Rights Act. So that comes into play when you're doing background checks. And I have some examples of things that I'll share with you where we've had clients that have been challenged on these things. And it's kind of interesting to see how that played out, but I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Some of the other laws that are out there that affect the background screening or impact it there's driving record regulations, the Driver's Privacy Protection Act, referred to as the DPPA. There's identity regulations that are in play with the U.S. Patriot Act, the I-9 Form I-9 regulations, and all of the E-Verify things, and all of that kind of stuff come into play. And then I mentioned a little bit about drug screening regulations, which is the DOT rule 49 CFR Part 40, affecting employers in the background screening arena. Now, this was kind of an interesting slide. I wanted to bring it up because when I was back in D.C., it was 2 years ago, I guess, the head of the EEOC came and spoke to us. And this is the highest person at the EEOC, and was explaining that they're on a mission to actually find discrimination and find these cases. And they, in 2014, and this is when, I think it's back when I was there 2 years ago, they sent out fines of they obtained almost $300 million in total monetary relief. So that's what the fines they charged to companies and for violation of these things. And the highest ranked one at 42.8% of the cases that they brought was under all of the statutes. So these are EEOC cases. The second most popular is a race discrimination at 35%. And then it kind of goes down from there with the discrimination against sex discrimination, disability, age, national origin, color, and then the equal pay. So it's important to know that the EEOC is really going after these people, companies, and there's a lot of suits being brought, a lot of complaints are being filed, and they're actually looking for them. She told us that they were spending money to increase their force, so they were growing their force of agents out to make it so that they could cover more of this. And there's opinions on both sides of that. Yes, it's important to be regulated. How much do we want to be regulated? There's an argument to be said there. These are tax dollars at play that are actually increasing an organization or a government organization and expanding. So again, there's two sides to that, but it's interesting to note that there are government agencies out there that are basically their mission is to go out and make sure that they're enforcing these laws. One thing I wanted to kind of talk about as far as a best standards practice is that there is guidance that's put out by the EEOC, and I'm going to give you an example. And this, talking with this woman back in Washington, D.C., gave me some really interesting insight to some things. So they do have EEO guidance that they've put out, and we actually in our organization follow that guidance to the T. There was one case where one of our clients actually got a discrimination complaint against them, and the EEOC came to my client and said, you need to answer these claims, and you need to this person wasn't hired. She happened to be a minority woman, and she wasn't hired. Well, we went back through the cases, and some of the things that the EEOC guidance says is you have to consider the length of time it had been, you have to consider how many of them there are, you have to consider what the charges were, if they were violent or anything like that. So we went back in this lady's record who filed the complaint with the EEOC, and we looked at those records. One of them had been just a couple of months ago, and it was for aggravated assault, and it was she had 7 or 8 charges against her for similar, or 4 or 5 years ago. So when you consider the time that has passed since the crime occurred, then you can't really bring those into consideration. But because one of them had been just a past couple months, we left those on, and so we actually followed exactly along the EEOC guidelines, those to the T, and we sent a letter and showed them, spelled out exactly according to your own guidance. We followed these, and they immediately dropped the complaint against my client. Here's the problem. My client had to bring in their legal counsel. They had to get us involved. They spent over $25,000 to fight this claim that was bogus, just because the EEOC is very aggressive about pursuing these things. So I just wanted to bring that out. It's a real life experience that I've been involved with that shows how they're really going after people, and there are real dollars to the bottom line of the company where they have to defend these things even if they're following the guidance. So when I say best practice standards to comply and follow the EEOC guidance, that doesn't even guarantee that you won't get a complaint filed against you. But it does help to eliminate any situations that might escalate further. And that example that I shared also shows that. So that's important to look at those things. Complying with the Fair Credit Reporting Act is imperative. We've seen lawsuits all over, the Spokio case, GM. Some of these big companies are being sued because they're not sending out pre-adverse action letters, or they didn't comply with certain things. And again, with these no harm lawsuits, even if you're violating the law but it doesn't hurt anybody, you still have the liability. So it's important to look at that and make sure that you minimize your risk and liability from hiring any employees that aren't going to be able to help your organization grow and flourish. So one of the things also I wanted to talk about was what is a good background search? How do we know what they are, and how do we do the search? You have to remember that background screening is not an exact science. You can't just go to one place, push a button, and get all the information on somebody. It just doesn't work that way. I know that with the movies and Jason Bourne and CSI out there, they can flip through these futuristic screens and pull up, everything they want to about a person, and it really just doesn't work that way. So criminal records and information about people are housed in jurisdictions throughout the United States. There are, thousands of courthouses across the nation, thousands of county jurisdictions. Even within the county, they may have several municipal courthouses, and not all of these courthouses communicate with each other. Not all of them, get together and collaborate and get information on people. So it's really not an exact science. There's a lot of work to finding out if someone has committed some egregious crimes and disqualify them to work for you. Also, there's a possibility of missed records and false positives. Again, because of the fact that there are so many organizations. There's 96 or 97 federal jurisdictions, including all of the federal courts, and then Puerto Rico. So, there are so many different areas where you can go, and if you're not looking in the right place, if you're looking in a county where this person committed a federal crime, and it may not be reported in the county level, it's in the federal courts because it was prosecuted by the FBI, then there's going to be missed records, and there's a possibility that someone would have the same name and the same date of birth. I know that's crazy, but it's happened with us before. So even with an alternate identifier, there are times when you have the wrong person as something to look at, and you need to make sure that you have dispute processes in place. Again, the process is subject to human error. Background screening is not an exact science, and you can't. There's always going to be a human element to it, and there really are a lot of myths about background screening. I kind of touched on that, but there's not not one place to go for all criminal records, or a national 50-state database. You'll be sold that, I'm sure. A lot of people say that, and we use them too. We have databases that contain information from all 50 states, but just don't be fooled into thinking that that information contains everything on a person or an individual. It's very sporadic. Many of the states that contribute to that database, maybe it's only the Department of Corrections that sends information to there, and it's not information from each county seat that sends information. So they can be kind of deceiving, and you need to be careful about looking at one place for a criminal record. The other thing that I think is important to look at is taking your cost versus your tolerance. What is your goal in screening? Are you just looking to do your due diligence and just stay out of liability's way and say, hey, I did my due diligence, we did a background check on them? Then yes, you can do that and get away with it if that's a company policy. And you can use those database searches and just do a minimum screen and say, okay, I'm good with that. If your goal is really to keep a safe workplace and make sure that some of those things that I mentioned earlier slides about productivity, about employee theft and things like that, and you really want to make a difference and not have criminals in your workplace, then it's going to obviously cost a little bit more, but you're going to get a better screen. And that's where we send court investigators into residences and areas where they've lived. And I'll go over that in my next slide of what's the best practice. But it's kind of important to look at that and make sure what your goal is in screening and understand who you're hiring, who your employees are, your employee population that you already have, the safety of those employees. Also, what type of work they're going to be doing. Are they going to be working in a warehouse? Are they going to be out driving a forklift? So maybe some of the drug testing things, I know those are mandated, but those are all things to consider as looking at your cost versus your tolerance and what your goal is in screening. The best practices or the screening standards that I would look at are retrieving the records directly by hand from the county courthouse, so actually sending a court researcher and getting an up-to-date court record. In fact, the FCRA says that you as an employer cannot make a hiring decision based on a database search. So even if you do make a database search available, it does need to be confirmed with a current court record, and by sending a court researcher in to get the up-to-date information to that date, and that's the information that should be reported to you in order to be FCRA compliant. The recommended search scope is 7 years. So to go back, and don't get this confused. A lot of people get this confused with the scope of how far they're looking back in a county. What I'm talking about here is you go back where this applicant has lived in the past 7 years and do a search of every county they've lived in for the past 7 years. When you get into the counties and actually looking inside of the counties, you can go back farther than 7 years in certain states. There's federal laws that restrict you from going back 7 years on arrest records and things like that. That doesn't apply to convictions. So, but there are certain state laws that restrict convictions as well. But so it's that scope. You can go back 7 to 10 years. We've had situations where in Utah there is no restriction on how far you can go back, and we've found records on people that were convicted for first-degree murder, 35 years ago, and they're out on parole now and they're looking for a job. So we've had those situations come up, and I think it's important for the employer to know those things if you can report them, to understand and know those things. So you can go back. We have to be very careful about going beyond the 7 years because of the EEOC restrictions. But that type of stuff is important to know, and it's very important to have someone who understands those things of what you can and can't report, what you can and can't know as an employer, so that you don't get any of these discrimination get into discrimination problems with the EEOC or have the enforcement of the FCRA come after you. So, and I think that's it used to be the FTC. There's a new government agency that has been developed with I've just had a brain freeze, so I'll think of it in a second. Anyway, so it's important to understand that with the gold standards. Look where this person has gone to school, worked in any possible touch counties, and then the national database as well. So kind of in conclusion here, there are some other considerations that we look at. A lot of times the applicants know they have a criminal record, so they're going to falsify previous addresses, so it's important to look for those types of things. They falsify the employers they've worked for. If we look at it, the average person has lived in 2.5 counties in the past 7 years, so from a cost standpoint, you can get a pretty good idea of across the board on an average what it's going to cost you to do background screening if the screener does it county by county. There are packages available for people, so that's included in there. When you match records, you want to make sure and use an alternate identifier. You want to make sure that you have a date of birth, an address, a middle name, that we're making sure that this is the right subject and that we're matching the person with the right thing, because no one likes to be accused of a crime that they didn't commit. And on the other hand, you don't want to let someone into your place of work and compromise the safety of other employees, so you want to make sure you get that information. And again, courts very rarely use Social Security numbers as identifiers, just because they don't want to take that information and be liable for housing that information. So it's usually date of births, other identifiers that we look for. False positives are possible, like I said, and really the only way to handle this is through fingerprint confirmation, and that's different than doing a fingerprint screen. Confirmation is the only exact way to put that person on it. So I would say in my 20 years of doing this, I've only had to do a fingerprint confirmation once, and it turned out to be the person. I don't know why they submitted their backgrounds or their fingerprints when they knew it was them, but they were just trying to say it wasn't them. So moving on to the last slide here, I believe we're running out of time, but I just wanted to go over some of the effective non-FCRA tools. The Social Security search, or person search as sometimes it's called. That's important to find jurisdictions where this person has lived. This is a really good one too, an MVR to validate a correct date of birth. I don't know if many of you realize this, but when you get a driver's license, you have to take a original copy of your birth certificate. So an MVR is a very good way to validate someone's date of birth. And what's happening, we've had this probably a handful of times happen where our researchers will find a criminal record, but it won't match the date of birth that the applicant put on the application. It won't match it, but everything else adds up. It looks like the person. In some cases, we have pictures of them, and the employer says, yes, that's them, but it doesn't match the date of birth. So we get a permission from our clients to run an MVR on the person, and lo and behold, the criminal record matches his MVR, but it doesn't match what he put on the application. So these criminals are getting smart. They understand that we match things with date of birth, so they'll put their date of birth off by a little bit. These are for medical sanctions. If anyone does medical stuff, Medicaid sanctions, making sure that a doctor hasn't been sanctioned, things like that. Those are other effective tools that we have. The national database search, which I actually talked about, that's important because you can get information from the National Sex and Violent Offender Database. There's also Foreign Nationals Database. Don't get a lot of hits on this, but it's very popular. People looking at the terrorist watch lists. Also, there's a National Security Database, which contains a list of information from the FBI, U.S. Marshals, Secret Service. All of those federal agencies have a enforcement, and they prosecute crimes. And so all of those information is in databases like that, so it's nice to do that. In conclusion, I just wanted to sort of put up some things on here that it's important when you're hiring people and making hiring decisions that there are some things in place when you're doing criminal records. So this is kind of a list. I won't go over it. We're running low on time, but you can kind of see those up there. And just kind of as a slide that I have used, this is kind of a funny caption, but it's very true in real life. Why didn't you hire that programmer? He says he has 10 years experience in a language that just came out a year ago, and that's kind of stuff is happening all the time. I was going to have a slide for questions. It looks like we're really out of time. If you do have questions, we can actually, you can post those questions or send them to me or talk to me offline, get my information. Write down my number here. Feel free to get a hold of me. As far as the certification credits, those are on here. If you want to take those down while you're online, we will also be sending out an email to you that will give you these credits. This is for SHRM. The activity ID is right here, so you can see that you got. So you can prove that you got the credit for this. And then also on the recertification credit for the HCRI or what is it? I'm not sure I'm saying it right. Anyway, the HRCI credit is there. Here's the activity ID right down here. So feel free to write those down, and then also we will be providing those to you in an email. Thank you guys for your time. Sorry I kind of got off on some tangents. Hopefully it was informative and you guys got something out of this. I will turn the time back over to Scott, and we can go from there.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much, Wally. I appreciate it. What another great webinar. Very, very informative about the background screening industry right now. Really, really appreciate it. We did have some questions come in during the webinar from Christina, Alejandra, Melissa, several others. If you're currently listening, Wally, if it's okay with you, when we will provide those folks to you. If you can reach out to them via email and try to connect, would that be okay?
Yeah, that would be absolutely fine. I'm happy to do that.
Okay, super. Thank you very much. As a reminder, that an automated email will come out from the system to give you a link to the recording, and that will automatically happen 2 to 3 days after this is over, so you should certainly have that by early next week. And I encourage you to check out the posting of the recording also, if you would like, on our association's website. That's HROtoday.com/association, and just go to the Thought Leadership Council tab and TLC webinars. You'll see that listed there. Thanks very much, Wally. Thanks to everyone on the call. We appreciate it, and have a great rest of the day wherever you may be around the world. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
You're welcome. Bye.